I thought I'd give you guys a peek behind the paywall. This is a Madness episode, normally available only to premium subscribers. If you sign up via Substack or Patreon, check out madmethodpod.com/subscribe for convenient links. You'll not only get access to the archive of episodes like this on books such as The Magus by John Fowles, or Shadow Ticket by Thomas Pynchon, or PKD's The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, with new installments every month, you'll also get early access to each and every guest episode. Thanks for checking it out. Hello, I'm Brad Kelly, and you're listening to Method and Madness. This is a show about books, the people who write them, and the labyrinth to be explored between the words.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had it bad. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had.
James Ellroy, American Tabloid, 1995. An important landmark in crime fiction, historical fiction, and in fact, an innovator in the American postmodern tradition.
Good evening, peepers, prowlers, pederasts, pedants, panty sniffers, punks, and pimps.
Following on that great conversation I just had with Jacob Everett, I'm going to talk a little bit about the lineage of the style of this book, the history of Confidential magazine, which is the primary inspiration for Ellroy's semi-fictional Hush Hush magazine in the novel, and the bizarre fate of one of the real-life characters of American Tabloid, about whom, it turns out, an entire book has been written. And of course, I'm going to be stepping through a bunch of interesting stuff along the way. So I got really interested in the style of American Tabloid, this punchy, slangy, hard-edged, breakneck-paced thing, without so much as a moment's pause to smell the flowers. And I want to give us an example just so we've kind of got that voice in our head to begin with. This is a scene from a skirmish between Pete Bondurant and his Tiger Cab associates and some of the other Cuban exiles that have betrayed the cause. Quote, Pete dumped his headset. He saw Jimmy's nail-topped baseball bat on a shelf above the switchboard. He grabbed it and ran out to the parking lot. The sky was pitch black and the air oozed moisture. Pete swung the bat and worked out some kinks. Headlights bounced down 46th, low like your classic Cubano hot rod. Pete crouched by a tiger-striped Merc. The taco wagon swung into the lot. Fulo's Chevy glided in sans lights and engine right behind it. Rolando Cruz got out. He was packing a Molotov cocktail and matches. He didn't notice Fulo's car. Pete came up behind him. Fulo flashed his brights and backlit Cruz plain as day. Pete swung the bat full force. It ripped into Cruz and snagged on his ribs. Cruz screamed. Fulo piled out of his car. His high beams strafed Cruz, spitting blood and bone chips. Cesar Salcido piled out of the Spickmobile, wet your pants scared. Pete yanked the bat free. The Molotov hit the pavement and did not shatter. Fulo charged Salcido. The taco wagon idled at a high pitch, good cover noise. Pete pulled his piece and shot Cruz in the back. The high beams caught Fulo's part of the show. He's duct taping Salcido upside the face. He's got the taco wagon trunk wide open. There's dervish quick Fulo uncoiling the parking lot hose. Pete dumped Cruz in the trunk. Fulo nozzle sprayed his entrails down a sewer hole. It was dark. Cars cruised up and down Flagler, oblivious to the whole fucking thing. Pete grabbed the Molotov. Fulo parked his Chevy. He was lip-syncing numbers over and over. Salcido probably spilled the safe house address. The taco wagon was metal flake purple and fur upholstered, a cherry 58 Impala. Fulo took the wheel. Pete got in back. Salcido tried to scream through his gag. They hauled down Flagler. Fulo yelled an address, 1809 Northwest 53rd. Pete turned on the radio full blast. Bobby Darin sang Dream Lover, ear-splitting loud. Pete shot Salcido in the back of the head. Exploding teeth ripped the tape off his mouth. Fulo drove very, very slow. Blood dripped off the dashboard and seats. They gagged on muzzle smoke. They kept the windows up to seal the smell in. Fulo made left turns and right turns. Fulo made nice directional signals. They drove their coffin wagon out to Coral Gables Causeway very, very slow. They found an abandoned mooring dock. It ran 30 yards out into the bay. It was deserted. No winos, no lovebirds, no late-night flycasters. They got out. Fulo put the car in neutral and pushed it up on the planks. Pete lit the Molotov and tossed it inside. They ran. Flames hit the tank. The Impala exploded. The planking ignited, kindling quick. The dock whooshed into one long fireball. Waves lapped up and fizzed against it. Pete coughed his lungs out. He tasted gun smoke and swallowed blood off the dead men. The dock caved in. The Impala sunk down on some reef rocks. Steam hissed off the water for a solid minute. Fulo caught his breath. Chuck lives nearby. I have a key to his room, and I know he has equipment we can use. Now, Ellroy has, I think, willfully transcended the crime genre, but like any writer, he owes a great deal to his forebears. One of these, which he has named, is Dashiell Hammett, author of The Thin Man, The Maltese Falcon, and perhaps most importantly for Ellroy, according to Ellroy biographer Stephen Powell, the novel Red Harvest. Red Harvest was published in 1929, featuring the hard-boiled private detective known as the Continental Op, who first appeared in the legendary pulp magazine Black Mask in 1923. Red Harvest was largely inspired by Hammett's time as a Pinkerton agent and his possible assignment to break a miners' strike in Butte, Montana. In the book, the Continental Op is sent to the town of Personville, which the locals not so lovingly call Poisonville, and he's sent there on the request of a newspaper publisher who, as soon as the Op arrives, is murdered. The Op's investigation of this murder finds him at the center of a complicated dispute which has entangled a local industrialist, the mayor, and several competing gangs. All of this breaks out into total war, mostly it seems as a result of the Op's meddling. Now, this ought to sound a little bit familiar. I mean, it's kind of American Tabloid, but on a very small scale. And of course, I don't mean to imply any lack of integrity on Ellroy's part. It's just interesting to see the DNA here. Let me just read a little bit of Red Harvest and leave it to you to note any stylistic similarities. This is from Chapter 2, The Tsar of Poisonville. Quote, "The Morning Herald gave 2 pages to Donald Wilson and his death. His picture showed a pleasant, intelligent face with curly hair, smiling eyes and mouth, a cleft chin, and a striped necktie. The story of his death was simple. At 10:40 the previous night, he had been shot 4 times in stomach, chest, and back, dying immediately. The shooting had taken place in the 1100 block of Hurricane Street. Residents of that block who looked out after hearing the shot saw the dead man lying on the sidewalk. A man and a woman were bending over him. The street was too dark for anyone to see anybody or anything clearly. The man and woman had disappeared before anybody else reached the street. Nobody knew what they looked like. Nobody had seen them go away. 6 shots had been fired at Wilson from a .32 caliber pistol. 2 of them had missed him, going into the front wall of the house. Tracing the course of these 2 bullets, the police had learned that the shooting had been done from a narrow alley across the street. That was all anybody knew. Editorially, the Morning Herald gave a summary of the dead man's short career as a civic reformer and expressed a belief that he had been killed by some of the people who didn't want Personville cleaned up. The Herald said the chief of police could best show his own lack of complicity by speedily catching and convicting the murderer or murderers. The editorial was blunt and bitter. I finished it with my second cup of coffee, jumped a Broadway car, dropped off at Laurel Avenue, and turned down toward the dead man's house." Okay, cool. So I think we can definitely see some family resemblance there between Ellroy's style in American Tabloid and Hammett. But I got thinking of Hammett's style kind of in turn here and wondered if understanding his influences might help us get an even better grasp on Ellroy's style. The first person I thought of, based on my own meager understanding of 20th century letters, was Ernest Hemingway. And following down this kind of rabbit hole brought me to a short but very interesting article on the Library of America website. I'm just going to read pretty much all of it because I think this is pretty cool. Quote, "When Dashiell Hammett's novels began appearing at the end of the 1920s, reviewers frequently compared him to Ernest Hemingway, whose best-selling novel The Sun Also Rises had been published in 1926. Extolling Hammett's first novel, Red Harvest, 1929, the critic in Bookman magazine wrote, quote, "It is doubtful if even Ernest Hemingway has ever written more effective dialogue than may be found within the pages of this extraordinary tale." Across the pond a year later, a reviewer praised The Maltese Falcon, noting that, quote, "The writing is better than Hemingway, since it conceals not softness but hardness." That was all Hammett's publisher needed to take out ads with the bold-faced headline, quote, "Better than Hemingway." What the 2 authors thought of each other is not entirely clear, and it has certainly changed over time. In 1926, just before Hammett began working on Red Harvest, he included in the short story The Main Death a scene in which a character is reading The Sun Also Rises. 5 years later, he told an interviewer that the 3 living writers he admired most were Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ben Hecht. For his part, Hemingway asked his editor, Maxwell Perkins, to send him in Madrid a copy of the Glass Key as soon as it came out. This was an early novel of Dashiell Hammett's. And in the travel account Death in the Afternoon, 1932, Hemingway recalled that when his eyes were, quote, bad, his wife read the Dane curse aloud to him, mumbling past the more violent descriptions so the children wouldn't hear. The mutual respect was tested, however, when the two authors finally met and hung out in the same circles, and who was more offensive often depended on who was more drunk. One night, Hemingway inexplicably threw a highball glass at the fireplace, and an equally intoxicated Hammett lashed out at Hemingway's machismo and disparaged his literary depictions of women. Quote, he only puts them in his books to admire him. On another occasion at the Stork Club in New York, Hemingway provoked various people in the crowd and began taunting Hammett, who told him to stick to bullying Fitzgerald, and promptly left the club. An ongoing debate among scholars and fans concerns who influenced whom. While Hemingway was first to publish his writing in book form, Hammett's stories began appearing in magazines years earlier, mostly in black mask, which was probably not readily available to Hemingway, living in Paris at the time. Hammett biographer William F. Nolan probably has it about right, however, quote, they might be compared to a pair of scientists, an ocean apart, working on the same experiment, each solving it independently, end quote. So, Hemingway, for those of you familiar with the currents and history of 20th century English literature, I probably don't need to lay out in full kind of the influence of Hemingway's style. Clearly, he took a lot from his work at two newspapers, first the Kansas City Star and later the Toronto Star, and we can, I think, understand how the necessities of newspaper writing put a kind of primacy on efficiency, prioritize something like the informational and emotional load per word. But Hemingway is also well known for his so-called iceberg theory, which he lays out in his book, Death in the Afternoon. And I'm just going to give you the full thing here so we know what we're talking about. Quote, if a writer of prose knows enough about what he is writing, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above the water. End quote. So this just got me thinking about, well, American Tabloid is doing this very dramatic and almost singular kind of writing style, but does the iceberg theory apply to it? Let's take a look at a quick passage and just see what we can see. This scene I'm about to read here, readers may remember, the character of Ward Littell has been following Lenny Sands, the lounge singer, and I'm about to read the moment where Ward Littell finally gets some real dirt on Lenny Sands. Quote, a stretch of cars were parked outside a cocktail lounge, Perry's little log cabin. Lenny's Packard Caribbean was nosed up to the curb. Littell parked and walked in. A ceiling banner brushed his face. Welcome 1959 in silver spangles. The place was cold weather cozy. The decor was rustic, mock timber walls, hardwood bar, naugahyde lounging sofas. The clientele was all male. The bar was standing room only. 2 men sat on the lounge sofa, fondling. Littell looked away. He stared straight ahead. He felt eyes strafe him. He spotted phone booths near the rear exit, enclosed and safe. He walked back. Nobody approached him. His holster rig had rubbed his shoulders raw. He'd spent the whole night sweating and fidgeting. He sat down in the first booth. He cracked the door and caught a full view of the bar. There's Lenny drinking Pernod. There's Lenny and a blonde man rubbing legs. Littell watched them. The blonde man slipped Lenny a note and waltzed off. Platter's medley hit the jukebox. The room thinned out a few couples at a time. The sofa couple stood up, unzipped. The bartender announced last call. Lenny ordered Cointreau. The front door opened. Ice-pick Tony Ione walked in. One of Giancana's most feared underbosses started French kissing the barman. The Chicago mob killer suspected of 9 mutilation murders was sucking and biting on the barman's ear. Littell went dizzy. Littell went dry-mouthed. Littell felt his pulse go crazy. Tony/Lenny/Lenny/Tony. Who knows who's queer? Tony saw Lenny. Lenny saw Tony. Lenny ran out the rear exit. Tony chased Lenny. Littell froze. The phone booth went airless and sucked all the breath out of him. He got the door open. He stumbled outside. Cold air slammed him. An alley ran behind the bar. He heard noise down and left by the back of the adjoining building. Tony had Lenny pinned down on a snowdrift. Lenny was biting and kicking and gouging. Tony pulled out 2 switchblades. Littell pulled his gun, fumbled it, and dropped it. His warning scream choked out mute. Lenny kneed Tony. Tony pitched sideways. Lenny bit his nose off. Littell slid on ice and fell. Soft-packed snow muffled the sound. 15 yards between him and them. They couldn't see him or hear him. Tony tried to scream. Lenny spat his nose out and jammed snow in his mouth. Tony dropped his knives. Lenny grabbed them. They couldn't see him. He slid on his knees and crawled for the gun. Tony pawed at the snow. Lenny stabbed him two-handed in his eyes, in his cheeks, in his throat. Littell crawled for his gun. Lenny ran. Tony died coughing up bloody snow. Music drifted outside, a soft last-call ballad. The exit door never opened. Jukebox noise covered the whole. Littell crawled over to Tony. Littell picked the corpse clean, watch, wallet, keyring, print-sustaining switchblade shoved in, hilt deep. Yes, do it. He pulled them free. He got his legs. He ran down the alley until his lungs gave out. Now, we could break down this passage and think about all the stuff we learn and know and feel that isn't quite written on the page, but here's a few things that come to mind, and I'm sure you have other more interesting examples, but this is just kind of how the iceberg theory thing works. The whole passage is a straight-cut kind of action-violence scene, but when we consider that up to this point, Lenny Sands has been kind of a twerp, a foul-mouthed lounge singer, seemingly made to be pushed around. And then here we get this glimpse of him flying into a rage. We see the fear beneath the surface. All the homophobia in his act now takes on a new color when we know he'll kill a man who finds out his secret. And with that, I can't help but think that his murder of Tony Iommi isn't just to cover his own tracks, but might actually be an acting out of his subconscious hatred of himself and the pain around being a gay dude. And if we run with this idea, is there a broader point about the violence in this book and in the world of this book? Is the other violence in this book actually sublimation of deep-seated desires and motivations of other characters like we see it probably is here with Lenny? Further, I want to note the potency of the images Ellroy has scattered here. He may be more of a teller than a shower, but consider a phrase like, quote, Tony died coughing up bloody snow. Just how clear that is. How well it evokes the desperation of the moment. Or a little bit further up the page, quote, the Chicago mob killer suspected of 9 mutilation murders was sucking and biting on the barman's ear, end quote. And, note the way that this pairs Tony's sexuality with his penchant for violence as if they are two sides of the same coin. Of course, the fact that we can see all this and a million other things in the passage does not so much suggest that Ellroy is influenced by Hemingway, but that Hemingway did an excellent job of analogizing and articulating a phenomena present in just about all great prose writing. Now, as when just about any writer has their achievement summarized into a sentence or two, some of the resolution is lost in this perspective on Hemingway we're putting together so far. And I want to go just a little bit deeper here. Now, that great critic and enthusiast Harold Bloom referred to Hemingway as a poet. Now, of course, he didn't write these discrete literary units we call poems per se, though he wrote a couple as far as I know. But Bloom says, nonetheless, that Hemingway was a poet whose subject is, quote, extraordinary actuality. That is a kind of fidelity which goes, if we're going to make a visual arts corollary, it kind of goes beyond photorealism and maybe even impressionism to really nail the sense of what things are really like. And part of the way he accomplishes this is he doesn't force your prefrontal lobe to navigate a kind of labyrinth of text around the core imagery and sense feeling that he wants to convey.
He's a great, great, great artist. My admiration for... I was enormously fond of him as a man, too, because the thing you never get from his books was his humor.
Yes.
There's hardly a word of humor in a Hemingway book because he's so tense and solemn and dedicated to what is true and good and all that. But when he relaxed, he was riotously funny. And that was the level that I loved about him. And I enjoyed being with him. I used to go out and keep him company when he went duck shooting in Venice in the autumns. I have many strange memories of him like that. And I was enormously fond of him. But as an artist, I think that it's really... there are very few important writers, with the exception of Novikov, who have not been influenced to some degree by him. I think it's impossible to write the same as we did before he wrote.
And yet, do you not sense now that he's become, over the past 10 years, an old-fashioned sort of figure?
He's come back again, I think.
Yeah.
My hunch is, I don't know in England, of course, because these things vary in different countries. In America, he was in total eclipse for the last 10 years, but he's the sun is rising again, critically for him.
Now, there's something that all of this has got me thinking about. Hemingway comes out of the newspaper tradition and writes works of fiction that are inspired by his real life and with a kind of built-in ethic that they somehow capture the depth of real life. Hammett was also inspired by his real life, but wasn't really trying to portray a verisimilitude of the emotional depth of, what it is to be a human exactly, but rather to kind of punch us in the gut as a reader, to entertain us, fundamentally. The way watching a fight is entertaining, or perhaps watching someone escape a straitjacket. This really got me thinking about the spectrum of fiction to nonfiction. American Tabloid is a novel, and so it shows up in the fiction part of the bookstore, but it's a curious kind of fiction. It centers on some real events, it has real people as characters, and yet, of course, much of it has been imagined or presupposed by James Ellroy himself. I want to spend a little time thinking about American Tabloid along this spectrum, from fiction to fact. And I think the place where American Tabloid really lives, that very strange space in the middle, is one of the things that makes this book so fascinating and may make it so enduring. I mean, it's 30 years now since it's been published. I think there's a decent chance we're still talking about American Tabloid 30 years from now. So let's start all this on the fiction end of the spectrum. Okay, so when I first started conceptualizing this show, way back in December of last year, one of the major ideas I had about what might make for something interesting, unique, and maybe even illuminating was that I might play something akin to the Glass Bead Game from that great novel by Hermann Hesse. If you're not familiar, later in his career, right before he won his Nobel Prize, Hermann Hesse, the author of Steppenwolf and Siddhartha and Damien, wrote this book called Magister Ludi, or the Glass Bead Game. It's a massive book set in a kind of indistinct post-utopian future in which the academy has risen or sublimated to an almost pure religious order of cultural intelligence and consilience. At the core of this enterprise is a competitive game played by only the most well-rounded and well-read scholars. Hesse never quite gave away the details of the game, leaving it open for us, the reader, to interpret for ourselves how it might have actually looked. But one thing we do know is that the central sort of architecture of the game was to draw connections between two disparate cultural artifacts. One might connect a classical concert to a poem, a philosophical movement to some convention in interior design, or in my case, I considered putting together something that would be like, what if H.P. Lovecraft wrote Moby Dick? What if Philip K. Dick wrote Paradise Lost? Things like this. An almost random pairing of books and authors. So here I want to play a little bit of the Glass Bead Game with two books. American Tabloid by James Ellroy, of course, and another book that has been basically haunting me since I first read it last year, and it's on the tip of my tongue because I read it again recently in order to record an episode of Book Club from Hell with Jack B.C., so look out for that in the coming weeks. And this book is Omesville by Ernst Junger. Now, if you haven't read Omesville, don't worry, because I think I can give you enough of what you need to understand what I'm getting at here. Omesville is almost not a novel. In fact, it reminds me of something from another book I've talked about on this show, and that's the taxonomical approach to books in Gerald Murnane's The Plains. If you put Omesville in the that library on the Plains, owned by the, what do they call them, the landowner, it's likely that it would be labeled as a book of history or philosophy, or maybe even whatever word the Plainsmen use for psychology. It's a very strange book. Why do I say this? Well, because the plot of Omesville is actually sort of paper thin. One could fairly accurately describe the events of the book in just a few sentences. There's a guy named Manuel Venator. He lives sometime in the far post-apocalyptic world, a world that has rebuilt itself on the patterns of both older times and modern times. The action is set in North Africa, say 1,000 years from now, or maybe 2,000 years from now. And there are regions in this world, in this time, that feel like blank spots on the map. Our hero, Venator, is a historical scholar with access to the Luminar, which is basically an idealized version of the internet. And meanwhile, this book was, I think, written in 1979 or published in 1979. Venator is also the night bartender at the Casbah, where his primary customer is the ruling tyrant named the Condor, along with the Condor's friends and associates. Venator is an anarch. That is, a man whose internal political philosophy is one predicated on individual freedom away from the crutches and constraints of society. Toward that end, he is building himself a bunker to survive the inevitable tumult of the next revolution. The rest of the plot I'll try to keep from spoiling, but I ought to note that the main thrust of the book is not so much the story as it is Junger's thinly veiled takes on history, mythology, politics, anarchism, and the types of people who are entangled with the forces of history. Now, just on this description alone, I'm starting to see a connection to Ellroy's American Tabloid. One of the things Ellroy is doing in his book is positing a theory of how history occurs, at least in America, and at least at this particular time, and at least in a very particular context. And I believe that in Ohmisville, Junge is doing something very similar in a very different way. And yet I think they can both be considered incredibly useful sources of insight into, for lack of a better term, how things work. And also give any writer out there who wants to construct a sweeping politico-historical novel something of a guide map. Both of these books show us many of the elements one likely needs to include in one way or another to achieve the kind of verisimilitude that makes even the most far-fetched premise plausible and gives the world in which it plays out the kind of reality that makes it worth reading. So I'm going to touch on a couple of these aspects that I think are included in both Tabloid and Ohmisville.
Police patrol excited crowds in Havana who found that while they slept, behind the scenes, strongman General Batista had overthrown the constitutional regime of President Carlos Prio. Once before, in 1933, when only an army sergeant, Batista staged a revolt. Now, as then, his co-conspirators in the army, navy, and police seized key points. The present coup was accomplished in only 77 minutes, but Cuba's political freedom is ended as Batista cancels the June 1st elections. Batista says he is a friend of the people as his soldiers patrol the streets to establish what he calls disciplined democracy.
The first similarity between these two books is the simmering revolutionary spirit. For Americans, it can be easy to forget, but any investigation into history reveals that there is an ever-recurrent tendency toward revolution in human political organization. Perhaps it doesn't always happen, but it always lies waiting for the right conditions. That clip I just played was made well before Fidel Castro rose to prominence, in a prior Cuban revolution. But by the end of this clip, you can already sense the forces at work that are inviting revolution. Now, fundamentally, what a revolution is the deposition of leadership and the replacement with something else. One means to accomplish this, of course, is to kill the sitting leader. In Ohmisville, we expect this might happen to the Condor, and in American Tabloid, we know this will happen to JFK. And while one might argue that, with JFK as a figurehead removed, it was still his administration that largely carried on. True enough, I suppose, but if one considers one of the prevailing ideas about why JFK was assassinated, many of the red lines in the corkboard turn back to Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president. By this lens, it was absolutely a revolutionary act. If we allow ourselves to buy into the cluster of Mafia Cuba CIA theories, the aim of that operation was certainly to replace the standing leadership with one more favorable to, let's call it, business enterprises.
I read Don DeLillo's
It was Libra,
groundbreaking novel, Libra. The Kennedy assassination, largely told through the eyes of Lee Harvey Oswald, in 1988, around the time I turned 40. I got hooked on the Kennedy assassination. I was 15 when it occurred. I had an unimaginably dim social sense. I didn't care that JFK had been killed. My dad and I, as he so succinctly put it, fuck that Mick cocksucker. We're Protestants and Republicans. So, my dad, me, that's us. We're orange on St. Patrick's Day. But put all that aside. His thesis that JFK brought about his own death pertaining to dirty deals his family did with a mob, renegade CIA agents, and crazy right-wing Cuban exiles, and his betrayal, his own betrayal of the exiles at the Bay of Pigs invasion mandated his own death, gored my goat, and did not let me go. I saw that the success of Libra, the profundity of Libra, scotched my shot at writing a book solely about the JFK hit, which I believe to be the world's most over-glamorized, over-sentimentalized, and over-scrutinized business dispute killing.
But of course, there's more to consider about leadership and revolution. And this is something that is very well articulated in Junger's book, The Forced Passage, which is a long essay that one can consider as the overtly theoretical companion piece and almost a foreword to the novel Ohmisville. And here I'm going to read from The Forced Passage. Quote, "Where the leaders or the symbols of the state are put on show, the plebiscite can take on a public character. The spectacle of great, passionately aroused masses is one of the most important signs of our entrance into a new era. Within these hypnotic spheres there reigns, if not unanimity, then certainly a single voice, because to raise a dissenting voice here would lead to uproar and the destruction of its owner. A single person seeking to make his presence felt in this manner might as well opt to attempt an assassination. It would lead to the same thing." End quote. What's also worth noting here about American Tabloid is that while the simplest way to describe this book would include a mention of the JFK assassination, when it comes to actual events of the book itself, the more prevailing assassination sort of in potential is actually that of Fidel Castro. A number of characters articulate their motivations and desire around killing him, right? Castro's assassination never really happens, but for those who've read both of these books, note the similarities between the Condor and Castro, which are much stronger between the Condor and Kennedy. The Condor has taken Omisville by force, for instance. He has dictatorial control, and there seems to be a not insignificant cult of personality around, though of course this quality is shared by Kennedy as well. What all these figures, the Condor and Omisville, JFK and Kennedy, all share is a powerful personality that in some ways captures the imagination and focuses the political energies of the people they govern. This starts to highlight an important aspect of how historical forces work in both American Tabloid and Omisville, and perhaps the real world. This has to do with the relationship between power and personalities. Now, in Omisville, unlike in American Tabloid, there is no assassination. There is no revolution. Prior to the pages of the book, the Condor has taken Omisville by force through a kind of coup, kicking the what are known as the tribunes out of power. But in the pages of the book, there's really nothing but the tension that it might actually happen. A lot of the momentum of the book, Omisville, is about how various characters position themselves relative to power. Our hero, the narrator, Manuel Venator, as I said, he's a philosopher historian by day, and by night he works the bar in the Casbah, which puts him basically right next to the Condor. He's placed himself within the eye line of authority, though he is anything but a partisan. And here is a trope that seems to me true in life and true in history and is absolutely apparent in both of these books we're talking about. And that is the idea that power attracts for many different reasons. In Venator's case, he makes the perhaps dubious case that he is putting himself within eavesdropping distance of the Condor and his associates for basically historical reasons, to watch and observe and take notes. Though, in some level, as a reader, we're a little bit doubtful that that's actually the case. In American Tabloid, there are a number of people who are drawn to power and make sacrifices and compromises for the privilege. The most prominent case that comes to mind there is Kemper Boyd. And his sort of particular strain of attraction to the Kennedys, much like Venator's supposedly historical interest meets the conviviality of the tyrant, is such that Boyd wants to be a Kennedy. He wants the money and the class and the respect, and he wants that hotel suite. Now, if that's the case, why does Kemper lend his considerable competence to the assassination then of JFK? Well, one thing is that narratively, this is part of what engenders the compelling drama of the book. And in fact, what if you look closely enough, creates oftentimes the compelling story of history. And that is the competing and contradictory motivations of the personalities who make things happen. And this is something I think Ellroy, and it's true in Don DeLillo's Libra as well, something that he's really, really good at is highlighting the fact that history, sure, it's decided by people like JFK and Howard Hughes, but there are the fingerprints of a vast horde of people, some of whom have Wikipedia pages, some of whom don't, who have imposed their will on certain events or have been put into situations to which they've had to react, have had power that is power and influence that is maybe difficult to articulate, but has left an indelible mark on the way things are. And oftentimes in a sort of high-level look at history, these people can kind of get lost. And it's in starting to see this in Ellroy's work that I start really thinking about two things in conjunction with each other. And that is the effect that Ellroy's American Tabloid has on one's conception of the JFK assassination in all its historical context, and the literary device of the Luminar in Omisville. See, the function and appearance and operation of the Luminar, much like Hesse's Glass Bead Game, funnily enough, is never clearly laid out in an authoritative description in Omisville. But what we can say is that it seems to compile all known documentation and facts about history and allow access to them in two ways. One is not unlike how you might now experience searching for historical information in your internet browser, complete with AI summaries. Incredibly useful, of course. But the more interesting feature of the Luminar in Omisville is that apparently it can create something like a virtual reality experience of any historically documented moment. And it is through these experiences, for instance, observing the lives of figures from the German Revolution of 1848, that the main character of Omisville, Manuel Venator, comes to fully understand all the dimensions of his current situation. So I'm going to read a little bit from Omisville. Here in this passage, Venator is, as he often is, talking about what might happen in the city-state of Omisville at any given moment. Quote, regarding in particular the rules for, quote, conduct during domestic unrest, I've mentioned only the case of an alarm while I am in the Casbah, but the phonophore transmits the red alert in the city too. One must then expect unpredictable things, especially if weapons have not yet been distributed. Sometimes I play similar scenes at the Luminar, say from the history of the Caesars or the Russians before and after the Revolution. I close the door, draw the curtains, I am in the abyss. Then I take over the role of the monarch, say Nero, once he is notified that his bodyguards have left. This is one of the final omens. Now the palace becomes very lonesome, eerie. None of the friends, none of the powerful respond. Only a few freed slaves have remained. They hope he will put a swift end to it all. The Caesar is the person who can least conceal himself in this world. Strange how now, alone in the universe, he becomes similar to the anarch. Even though his mortal fear is breathing down his neck, he manages to get out a few significant asides. Even as the hoofbeat announces the arrival of pursuers, he quotes the appropriate Homeric verse, quote, thundering in my ear, and then the brilliant, quote, what a great artist perishes with me. He is too weak, too clumsy to stab himself. His secretary, Epiphotratus, I think, guides his hand. Incidentally, that was why Domitian had his benefactor executed. I would like to avoid getting mixed up in such quarrels by hearing, say, the condor tell me, quote, that is loyalty, as Nero told the centurion whose behavior was dubious, end quote. Now here's just a little bit later in that same chapter, quote, when I, as I am doing here at the Luminar, examine the powerful man's relationship to his opponent, I stumble upon the antithesis between the person who lays claim to freedom of action and the person who lays claim to freedom of thought. These are figures that recur not only in history but in myth as well, all the way into the animal kingdom. Fable lives on them. The lion is powerful. Reynard the fox is cunning. Fine. The antithesis lies deeper, within matter itself. The ruler embodies stasis. He is painted, like Zeus, sitting or standing. His adversary is nimble. There's hardly a more agitated sculpture than the bronze statue that the Athenians put up for the tyrannicides Harmodius and Aristogiton, both paid with their lives for the assassination. That is the classical ending when blood flows. I played a series of examples at the Luminar, from the assassination of Julius Caesar to the one in Sarajevo. These two murders were similar insofar as each provided the oriflamme for a world war. If we delve all the way into the atoms, differences vanish, like the ones between Caesar and that insignificant Austrian prince. Both men, like their assassins, were subject to the same constraint. In this, too, I go along with Vigo's idea that the historian has to supply images, not explanations. Nonetheless, the atomic reality has to shine through in color and drawing, in deeds and characters. End quote. Now, in that section, Manuel Venator could have just as well been talking about the JFK assassination, right? And this idea that the historian has to supply images, not explanations, I guess I leave it to you to decide which of those two Ellroy is doing in American Tabloid. Now, for those who aren't super deep on the work of Ernst Junge, not only is this bit that I just read, I think, an interesting example of how fiction can deal with history and actually provide an extra lens on history that helps us make sense of it, in fact. He's also doing the great Junge thing of applying his sort of bespoke stereoscopic process to concepts and ideas. One of the hallmarks of his thought is trying to see the individual contemporary moment very, very clearly while looking through the lens of several thousand years of history, as if casting his searchlight from now to the past, only to have it refracted to see once again the now. It's for this reason that his novels in particular, to me, are absolutely fascinating. Now, the more that I read through Omissville, thinking very carefully about the role the luminar plays, and again, the luminar is this device or process through which people can research history or actually enact virtual reality depictions of history, or at least approximations of historical events. And in that passage above, apparently Manuel Venator could actually play Nero for brief moments. But the more I thought about this as a literary device, the more I realized how effective a metaphor the luminar is, not only for the way that Junger sees history, but probably for how all good historical fiction treats the curious relationship between the present and the past. Because, of course, the luminar doesn't have actual video of, say, Caesar's assassination or the utopian communes of Fourier. It has a bit of data, and it fills in the empty spaces with best guesses, pattern matching, and thoughtful presuppositions so that we can think in a space where some of these bases have been covered for us. And isn't that, too, what Ellroy is doing in American Tabloid? He said somewhere that this trilogy is about, quote, the private nightmare of public policy. And it's true. And I think if one wants to grant a historical work like American Tabloid a special place in the intellectual discourse, it is that it serves as a kind of luminar. Because if we don't get a kind of nitty-gritty simulation of the past, one done, of course, extremely carefully, one very careful not to fall for the biases and political obligations of its own author, then all we will get, if we don't do that, then all we'll get is facts and figures and some headshots of famous people, and we'll come away understanding very little, in my opinion. Now, in order to move a little bit further along the spectrum from fiction to nonfiction, I want to counterpose the device of the luminar, both the device in the book and the concept of it as a literary device. I want to counterpose it to a fictional publication within the novel of Omissville, and of course within the city-state of Omissville. And this is the newspaper called The Wren, W-R-E. And I should note that Ernst Junger loves his animal metaphors, birds particularly, but insects, snakes, etc. He loves that kind of stuff. Now, a little bit of glass bead gaming here. The Wren exists as an important institution in Omissville, just like the magazine Hush Hush is an important institution within American Tabloid. And the fact that these institutions exist in both books, and I presume in similar books, though I don't know what book you would put in the Venn diagram overlap between these two. If anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear it. It calls to mind the fact that, to me, I think, and I'm just learning this by thinking about these two books, is that having a piece of media within the work of fiction is actually, I think, a key feature in making any modernist or postmodernist attempt at a historical fiction that's going to play on that grand socio-political stage. A writer has to consider the significant role played by the media, whether that's radio, newspaper, television, internet, whatever. Now, in the novel Omissville, the newspaper The Wren and its main writer and editor, a man named Zerwick, they're sort of tolerated to a certain degree by the Condor, who, as we've noted, was a tyrant. Now, this lines up very well with Junger's notion of sort of how tyrannies and dictatorships, in his opinion, every government operates. He will make the claim that a little bit of opposition is actually crucially important for having a functional tyranny. Not that he wants one, but just that's how they work. And the reason that a little opposition is always tolerated is because it creates this satisfying illusion of freedom. And we can sort of see this in Hush Hush, too. It's like, okay, there's this magazine that's going to give us all the inside dirt on celebrities and political figures, but in fact, it's being used as an intelligence gathering tool and a propaganda tool by the very institutions that it might feel like they stand in opposition to. I hope that makes sense. Here's a passage that I think is relevant to all this from the novel Omissville. Quote, "Recently, when I was at the Luminar," and just as an aside, that means that Manuel Venator is up late at night exploring history through virtual reality, right? And continuing on, quote, "Participating in a parade on Berlin's Tempelhof Field, a certain incident reminded me of Zerwick's trapeze acts," that is the editor of The Wren. Continuing on, "The King of Prussia was taking his good time. A cobbler's lad who was sitting in a tree called out, quote, 'Ain't the creep coming yet?' A policeman yanked him down. 'You goddamn brat, who did you mean?' 'My brother, of course. Who else?' At last the king came and reviewed the troops. Afterward, the cobbler's lad went over to the officer of the peace, quote, 'Officer, who did you mean?' This roughly corresponds to the winks in Zerwick's essays. Many people are surprised that the condor puts up with him. His tolerance, too, runs a gamut, for depending on the weather, this scribbler can develop from a court gesture to a thoroughgoing nuisance, and finally to a dangerous man. At present, he is in the middle range, so he could still be gotten rid of without any scandal. After a change, at which point I would retreat to the acacia grove, he might be the great man in Omissville for a few weeks. Even his opponents have to admit that he is eminently gifted as a journalist. The Domo himself reads every issue of the Wren hot off the press, end quote. And for those of you who haven't read Omissville, the Domo is the condor, the tyrant, his right-hand man, and in personality is not unlike J. Edgar Hoover. I guess the key difference between Hoover in American Tabloid and Domo in Omissville is that the Domo actually likes the condor, whereas Hoover hates Kennedy. Anyway, the key here is to understand, I think, how useful a piece of media can be to the governing powers, even when that media is, to its own mind, almost completely separate from those governing powers and even in opposition to them. We find out later in Omissville that, strategically, the existence of the Wren for the Domo is useful for other reasons. He gets the ideas of the opposition out there in the open so he can keep an eye on them, and because he forces the journalists of the Wren to cross ethical lines in order to get their information, he not only gets them into a moral and legal trap. In Omissville, to be a real journalist is effectively to be guilty of bribery, and this is a charge that can be called up on them at any time. He also gets to have someone digging up dirt on political functionaries and figures further down the hierarchy without getting his own hands dirty. I don't think it's a real reach to see similarities between the Domo and the Wren in Omissville to J. Edgar Hoover and Hush Hush in American Tabloid. Okay, so that about does it for my little glass bead game between Omissville and American Tabloid. But I'm going to stay near this coordinate along the fiction to nonfiction spectrum for a little bit. You know, we were talking about the Wren and Hush Hush, these quote-unquote media institutions within the fictional worlds of Omissville and I guess the less fictional world of American Tabloid. And I want to talk about one of the major inspirations for Hush Hush and for Ellroy's career entirely, and that is the magazine that goes by the name Confidential.
Remember, dear readers, you heard it here first. Off the record, on the QT, and very hush, hush.
Now, we talked a little bit about Confidential magazine in part one of this series, the conversation with, and in fact, the name of his literary journal is Apocalypse Confidential, you know, inspired by this entity. But what the heck was Confidential magazine anyway? Okay, on a very high level, it was a magazine that ran from December 1952 to 1978 and was an important landmark in the development, or I guess, what's that word when cancer spreads? Metastasization? I can never quite say it. Anyway, it was an important landmark in the development of expose, gossip, and scandal journalism. Later iterations of this would be the supermarket tabloids, such as the National Enquirer, the National Examiner, stuff like that. So this guy, Robert Harrison, had been working on an earlier, cruder tabloid called the New York Evening Graphic, often dubbed the Pornographic by its critics for its emphasis on sex. Combining this with his tenure at the Motion Picture Herald, Harrison knew that sex sold. Before Confidential, he started up a magazine called Beauty Parade, which was basically just a magazine with pictures of beautiful, often famous women. And he actually used the same methodology to start up a handful of other more niche versions of Beauty Parade. Nonetheless, by 1952, his enterprise was broke, and by refusing to go the direction of Playboy, Harrison was unable to keep the whole thing afloat. But he did have a good idea, and in December of 1952, he started Confidential magazine. Here's a bit from the book Shocking True Story, The Rise and Fall of Confidential, America's Most Scandalous Scandal Magazine, by a man named Henry E. Scott. Quote, Harrison launched his semi-monthly Confidential with a press run of 150,000 and a racy mix of stories that included a feature on a homosexual wedding, a portfolio of pictures of women in their underwear, an expose entitled I Was Tortured on a Chain Gang, and a quote-unquote science story by a Manhattan psychiatrist that revealed that athletes are lousy lovers. No matter that the gay wedding, purportedly set in Paris, was staged and photographed in Harrison's New York City apartment, that the chain gang story was utter fiction, and that the underwear pics were retreads from Harrison's stable of girly magazines. End quote. The magazine had a decent readership to begin with, but it would be almost 9 months before it started to break out and just print money. And it accomplished this in much the same way that the movie studio 20th Century Fox did. And this was by zooming in on a character who shows up in American Tabloid, the singular Marilyn Monroe. Here's from Confidential's big 1953 article on Monroe's relationship with two Joes. Joe DiMaggio, the baseball player headed for the Hall of Fame, and Joe Schenck, the head of 20th Century Fox, who was both infatuated with Monroe and effectively started her career. Quote, "From his place in the matrimonial batter's box, Joe DiMaggio said practically nothing. It wasn't unusual. DiMaggio's always been the kind of man who let his actions speak for themselves, and his devoted attention to Marilyn spoke volumes. He even prompted the wrath of his ex-wife, Dorothy Arnold, who sued for complete custody of their 9-year-old son, on grounds that DiMaggio was taking Joe Jr. along on his dates with the chesty blonde. It was as obvious as a line drive into Yankee Stadium bleachers that Joe was wearing his heart on his sleeve for Marilyn, but he, too, knew he was fanning out like a bush leaguer with Marilyn. He couldn't figure out, for some time, who the opposition manager was. Fans of Joe's and Marilyn's, who are still scratching their heads over this puzzle, can relax. The answer is Joe Schenck, an old artist at the fadeaway pitch in the Hollywood League. Genial Joe, Schenck that is, said no dice when Marilyn went to him to confess palpitations of the heart over one of the best ball players since Babe Ruth. In effect, he told her, quote, "Have fun, kid, but don't get serious." That was enough to change a four-bagger into an easy out. The uninitiated may well inquire how a balding, squat little gnome, old enough to be her grandfather, could exert such a strong influence over the beauteous Miss Monroe. Insiders will confess they, too, are often a little baffled over Joe's Rasputin-like powers, but none deny his abilities. Schenck, they point out, occupies the role of a father in Miss Monroe's life. He guides the luscious blonde's career, inspires her ambitions, lauds her triumphs, and lulls her fears. He's always there with a paternal hug or a strong shoulder to cry on. It was he who assigned top designers to create a wardrobe that beautifully just misses clothing Miss Monroe. To him go the honors for putting witty writers to work spinning those headline-catching remarks she makes. Here's a sample comment against sunbathing from Marilyn. Quote, "I like to be blonde all over." End quote. To others, Joe Schenck might be a bald-headed old man. To Marilyn, he was and is the kind of guy every little girl wants. The man who snaps his fingers and gets results. End quote. Now, this little bit I just read straight from Confidential magazine, their breakout issue, kind of has it all. The scandalous relationship between the famous man and his wife, the sexy blonde with an innuendo in almost every phrase, the implication of a love triangle with Joe Schenck, and even a little bit of racial politics with a reminder to their readers of Schenck's Russian heritage, especially when one notes that Harrison himself had ties to Russia through his father, and as Jews trying to find their footing in America, they'd taken the name Harrison in homage to the U.S. President Benjamin Harrison, who'd spoken out against the Russian pogroms. Now, throughout the existence of Confidential magazine, the editorial direction would be largely Hollywood. There are a lot of reasons for this, and at least some of them are the same reasons that Hollywood was such a target for the House Un-American Activities. That is, the hunt for communists by the federal government following World War II. It's not so much that there were more communists among actors than among other people, but that just as films are some kind of attempt to play out a resonant sequence of events that tells us about ourselves, the court of public opinion also needs its chess pieces for all of us to move around. And actors are as good a pawns as anyone else, maybe even better. Here in Confidential, though, while politics are often part of it, a different game is being played. Here's another little bit on this from Rise and Fall. Quote, "Young Americans who had left the farms and towns of Middle America to fight overseas in World War II had come home with a more cynical and sophisticated view of the world than what Hollywood was offering." End quote. And what Hollywood was offering had largely been determined by the Hays Code, a Motion Picture Association of America system of testing, tempering, and tailoring the overall message of Hollywood, effectively a censorship code developed through a curious consortium. There was an American Studies professor at Brandeis who refers to the post-Hays Code Hollywood as, quote, "a Jewish-owned business selling Roman Catholic theology to Protestant America," end quote. Now, I think in a way when corporations and quasi-governmental authorities try to overly sanitize the popular everyday myth we're telling ourselves with television and film, we all react in a way to sort of correct the record, and sometimes this can get kind of lurid, right? And it's all really an attempt, I think, to counterbalance the lie that we feel like we're being told. When this recalibration process runs amok, we get a magazine like Confidential and The Inquirer, but of course there's more to it than that. There's another figure, one a little more public than Robert Harrison, that one has to be familiar with to understand not only the phenomenon of Confidential magazine, but the tabloid thing entirely. And this is a man named Walter Winchell. He'd once been a columnist for New York Evening Graphic, that magazine I mentioned earlier that Robert Harrison came out of, that some people called the Pornographic. And his job, in fact, was taken over by none other than Ed Sullivan in the days before his television show. And after the New York Evening Graphic, Walter Winchell became one of the most prominent quote-unquote entertainment columnists and radio broadcasters of his day. He was noted particularly for his slangy way of speaking, an approach that made his often over-the-top claims of scandal and impropriety too slippery for libel cases. While he wasn't, properly speaking, involved with Confidential magazine, in the early to mid-1950s he was perhaps the magazine's biggest booster, which led to a kind of positive feedback loop between Winchell and Confidential, with Confidential becoming ever more scandal-focused, arguably unethical, and of course very, very popular.
It's time, America. Time for Walter Winchell. Presented to you by Gruen, the precision watch. Gruen, the finest watch you can wear. Gruen, the finest watch you can give. Brings you the man who gives America the news. Walter Winchell of the New York Daily Mirror and the Washington Post.
Mr. North to South American, all the ships at sea, let's go to press. Havana, Cuba. Batista has smashed another revolutionary plot. Over 40 persons arrested. One plotter is believed to be an American. Karachi. The Pakistani government has reported to Parliament in secret session. The Pakistani faces starvation. Las Vegas newspapers. There will be much bigger headlines than ever. This weekend, upcoming weekend, with the very next, very terrible, atomic blast. New York City. Graham Cole, 63, the top executive of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, New York, jumped to his death from his 8th floor apartment. He left no notes. Joplin, Missouri. It's a baby boy for the Mickey Mantles of the New York Yankees. Detroit, Michigan. It's a baby girl, cesarean, for Marjorie Hughes, the daughter of orchestra leader Frankie Carl.
Now, Robert Harrison, in order to keep Confidential magazine going, utilized a number of Hollywood insiders to get his stories, which more often than not had a kernel of truth. I want to read about some of these because I think that these are characters that James Ellroy would just love. Here's from that Rise and Fall of Confidential magazine book. Quote, "Among the magazine's most important tipsters was Veronica Ronnie Quillen, a beautiful red-headed prostitute and madam, then in her late 30s, who was known to tabloid writers as the Soiled Dove. Quillen had briefly been married to screenwriter Joseph Quillen, perhaps best known for the movie Our Miss Brooks of 1956, before becoming what magazines called, quote, Hollywood's #1 madam. Quillen had emerged from Hollywood's darker shadows in 1949 when newspapers reported that her ear was almost severed by a razor in a fight with French singer Roland Gerbeau. In December 1950, she was in the headlines again when she was arrested for cutting up singer Billy Daniels with a butcher knife while he was at her apartment. She later made news by using a razor to slash Herb Jeffries, an actor known as the Bronze Buckaroo for his role in several all-black westerns, and her husband at the time. She agreed to gather information from her network of girls and to inform on former lovers such as Jeffries and Desi Arnaz. There was also the exotic Countess Francesca de Bourbon y de Scaffa, 24, a blonde Venezuelan beauty who also claimed at various times to be of Italian, Chinese, Hindu, French, and Egyptian ancestry. De Scaffa, whose slight film career included minor appearances in On the Riviera of 1951 and Captain John Smith in Pocahontas in 1953, tooled around Hollywood in a white Jaguar. She was the former wife of actor Bruce Cabot and the paramour of Clark Gable, Orson Welles, and the Shah of Iran, whose indiscreet cables to her were to be lavishly displayed in a confidential story. Another consort was Jaime Bravo, perhaps Mexico's most famous bullfighter at the time. In Hollywood, rumor had it that the mysterious and beautiful De Scaffa was the illegitimate daughter of the King of Spain. She offered to have an affair with any man if it got a story for Confidential. And then there was Fred Otash, a former LA Vice Squad cop with a lust for celebrity and a skill at wiretapping. While still a cop, Otash managed to sell Louis B. Mayer an idea for a movie, appear on a television program extolling his success in curbing shoplifting at Los Angeles' farmers market, and bed more than a few actresses. Quote, good-looking actresses and showgirls have a yen for strong, protective men, Otash explained. His passion for publicity and his rebellious personality had put him at odds with police chief William Parker, who fired him. Otash promptly opened a private investigation agency. He became an FBI informant on the LA mob and sold Robert Harrison information on his clients and on girlfriends such as Kim Novak and Anita Ekberg. For Otash and others of Confidential's more productive informants, the work was lucrative. By 1955, Otash was making $35,000 a year from the magazine. End quote. And just by the way, $35,000 a year in 1955, that's more than $350,000 a year now. Now, just as a side note, I think it's worth pointing out that this Fred Otash character actually served as one of the real-life inspirations for Pete Bondurant in American Tabloid and other parts of the Underworld trilogy. Now, I've kind of laid out some of the stuff that Confidential magazine was into, but it wasn't all just sex and drugs.
Eric Johnston, Motion Picture Association president, welcomes the congressional investigation of Hollywood.
The motion picture industry has been accused of putting subversive and un-American propaganda on the screen. We deny that without any reservation. The pictures themselves are complete proof of its falsity. We are accused of having communists and communist sympathizers in our employ. Undoubtedly, there are such persons in Hollywood, as you will find elsewhere in America. But we neither shield nor defend them. We want them exposed.
A packed House caucus room. Here's J. Parnell Thomas, chairman of the Un-American Activities Committee, open the hearings.
This committee, under its mandate from the House of Representatives, has the responsibility of exposing and spotlighting subversive elements wherever they may exist. It is only to be expected that such elements would strive desperately to gain entry to the motion picture industry.
Now, where things get really interesting, to me at least, is the way in which Confidential veers more and more into politics and more, strictly speaking, the kind of quasi-ideological culture wars we're more familiar with today. And this requires us to talk, at least briefly, about a man named Howard Rushmore and a story about J. Robert Oppenheimer. I'm just going to read most of the Confidential magazine article on J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's entitled The Strange Death of J. Robert Oppenheimer's Red Sweetheart, and red is in all caps, of course. Quote, police found her nude body in the bathroom of her San Francisco apartment. There was a grim touch of neatness, even comfort, in the way she had met death. After filling the tub with water, she had arranged a stack of pillows around the edge and drowned herself. But in the fireplace in the living room, a wisp of smoke still curled from a half-burned stack of documents, and her father was explaining to the bewildered cops that he had been burning her, quote, private correspondence. The California newspaper shrugged off the story as a routine suicide, describing the girl as Dr. Jean S. Tatlock, 29, a psychiatrist and daughter of Dr. John S. Tatlock, University of California English professor. The date was January 6, 1944. The full details behind the Ophelia-like death in the pillow-lined bathtub have never been disclosed until now. For the pretty doctor who left a note saying she was, quote, disgusted with everything, end quote, had a few months before been a vivacious, happy person with that inward glow that comes only to a woman in love. And in the same apartment where tragedy was to strike, she had entertained for the entire night a married man whose name has been on page 1 of the nation's newspapers for the past year. Jean Tatlock's self-confessed lover was J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atom bomb. What made this sad-eyed scientist with the crew haircut and the almost posed look of a wistful Ivy Leaguer leave at a critical state in the development of the world's most dangerous weapon to keep a tryst at Jean's apartment at 1405 Montgomery Street? Only recently, the Atomic Energy Commission denied Oppenheimer's security clearance and publicly announced that it had found fundamental defects in his character. The key to the mystery may revolve around the statement Oppenheimer made under oath to the AEC. Quote, she, Miss Tatlock, was, as it turned out later, a friend of many fellow travelers and communists, a number of whom I later was to become acquainted with. Why did Jean Tatlock introduce her circle of red friends to the man who, in 1941, was one of the few persons in the world who knew about the planned construction of the A-bomb, a secret that Soviet spies were spending millions to discover? End quote. This article, by the way, was published in November 1954, Confidential magazine. Now, if you saw the Oppenheimer film, you may remember all this. Oppenheimer, who made the bomb possible, had a secret lover with communist ties. But, of course, it has all the classic conventions of a confidential piece, except the Hollywood angle. And, very important for our comparison here to American Tabloid, the publication of this article put Confidential magazine in the good graces of a certain J. Edgar Hoover, who was convinced that Oppenheimer was a Soviet agent. But there's one other story that's very interesting here, and that's the story of the man who wrote this article, a certain Howard Rushmore, who, as a young man, had been an enthusiastic member of the Communist Party, and in his career would become one of the most steadfast, quote-unquote, journalists against the cause. Now, let me tell you the story of Howard Rushmore. Howard Rushmore was born in 1913 and raised dirt poor in the little town of Mexico, Missouri, where he stood out as a gangly 6'5" teenager who, by age 16, was already doing whatever journalism jobs he could. He was also tending toward communism, a drift initiated by his mother's love for FDR and, just his general conditions living in the Great Depression and, by all accounts, living at kind of the bottom rung of society. This move towards communism was finally cemented after he witnessed the well-known and horrific lynching of Raymond Gunn in Maryville, Missouri. After that, he joined the Young Communist League USA, with no technical understanding of Marx, by the way, and began organizing farmers in the Dakotas. Not long after, he found himself writing for the Daily Worker, which was, more or less, the newspaper of the American Communist Party. His work there would see him rise to become the paper's official film critic in 1939, holding the position for just a few months before being fired for his ambivalent review of Gone with the Wind. Though he didn't care much for the film, he admired Gone with the Wind's technical accomplishment and wasn't convinced that the film was particularly racist. So the Daily Worker canned him. And this began Rushmore's personal crusade against communism, however and wherever it might appear. Howard Rushmore's passion and his mediocre to halfway decent journalistic prowess led to involvement with the decidedly anti-communist Hearst papers and a role as a key witness in the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, where he testified against Edward G. Robinson, Charlie Chaplin, Dalton Trumbo, and others. But his rabid anti-communism wasn't just for public figures. At one point, he wrote an expose in the New York Journal American on an elementary school teacher who he claimed was a secret communist organizer for longshoremen unions. After this report, she was fired by the NYC Public School District and shortly thereafter killed herself, a fact of which Rushmore was rather proud. The utter intensity of his anti-communism, paired with a personal desire for notoriety, led to sensationalist stories which, according to FBI reports, could not actually be trusted. Nonetheless, McCarthy hired him as a director of research for a 1953 HUAC-like investigation into Voice of America, which Rushmore sabotaged because he couldn't help but to write sensational articles about the committee's strategy. He was pretty quickly almost as much an enemy of the Hearst papers and McCarthyites as he was of the communists. But we're not done with him yet. Howard Rushmore's technical proficiency, and more importantly, his willingness to roll in the mud, found him a job via Walter Winchell at Confidential magazine, of which he became chief editor around late 1953 or early 1954, after which it would become arguably the biggest selling magazine in the country. All of this seems to have pretty much gone right to Howard Rushmore's head. His amphetamine usage increased, as did his intake of booze. He clashed with Robert Harrison, the owner of Confidential magazine, and others, and proposed wild, often baseless, and vindictive stories, like his planned expose of Eleanor Roosevelt, who he claimed was both a lesbian and was sleeping with her black chauffeur. I love this story in a way because it's kind of zany and like, who really wants to besmirch Eleanor Roosevelt of all people? I also think James Ellroy references it in an interview somewhere, but I couldn't find it when I went looking for it again. Anyway, Howard Rushmore also published numerous stories about men in Hollywood that he considered to be homosexuals. Some of them might actually have been, and others probably weren't. All this gets me thinking that, it's like people say that the personal is political, but I do sometimes wonder if the political discourse that we see today, as it is on social media and elsewhere, I sometimes wonder if it isn't just like the outward manifestation of real personal issues, right? It's like, like you hear someone screaming out about, fill in the blank, whatever public figure. And it's like, if they didn't have that person to scream about, wouldn't they just be screaming about somebody else, right? Anyway, just to finish off this story about Howard Rushmore. In late 1955, he appeared on the Tom Duggan radio show on KBLA and claimed he was looking for a so-called communist operative involved in the assassination of Navy Secretary James Forrestal in 1949. Now, the official story was that Forrestal, after being ousted from the Truman administration and suffering a bout of ill health, had thrown himself from a 16th floor window. But Howard Rushmore wasn't convinced. After discussing this on the radio and asking for the public's help, Howard Rushmore disappeared from his Chicago hotel, sparking an FBI manhunt. Now, it would turn out that Rushmore was just chilling in Butte, Montana, but even then he claimed he was undercover hunting terrorists. It wasn't long after this that Howard Rushmore's tendency to alienate everyone around him got him fired from Confidential magazine in late 1955, but only after making a deal with Robert Harrison that the magazine would help Rushmore out on the many upcoming defamation and libel suits. See, there was a lot of legal trouble coming on the wave of insanity that Rushmore had promulgated, and as public opinion turned against McCarthyism.
Hollywood was more than ready to fight back. Liberace and Maureen O'Hara led the brigade.
It shocks me to realize the availability of this magazine and this type of literature on practically every newsstand in the United States.
All hell broke loose after the stories about Liberace and Maureen O'Hara, and then Attorney General Pat Brown, Jerry's father, who was running for governor, appointed one of his deputies to launch a grand jury investigation of Confidential.
On May 15, 1957, a Los Angeles grand jury indicted Confidential publisher Bob Harrison and 10 members of his staff on criminal libel charges. The prosecution also claimed that 3 entire issues of the magazine were lewd and obscene, though they contained no nudity or obscene language and included articles like The Truth About Social Security and Meet an Honest Senator. Confidential fought back by issuing subpoenas to every celebrity who had ever been featured in the magazine.
When we started subpoenaing people, that sort of caused a mass exodus from Hollywood, since these people obviously didn't want to get involved.
The trial was a star-studded affair. Despite the furor that Confidential had set off, it was not easy to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the magazine was guilty of criminal libel.
Now, keep in mind that Confidential had a procedure where they wouldn't print a story without having generally at least 2 sworn affidavits from their sources.
In 1957, the state of California sued Robert Harrison, founder of Confidential magazine, for publishing career-destroying allegations with very little evidence. This was a very big deal. Many celebrities fled the state of California to avoid being called to the stand. Robert Harrison himself, safe in New York, was beyond the prosecutor's reach, so instead it was Harrison's niece and husband, the duo running the Hollywood office, who bore the brunt. And the state's star witness? None other than Howard Rushmore, who considered himself a kind of hero for exposing Confidential, though he was one of the most significant people doing this work, right? I mean, this Howard Rushmore guy's a real jerk. Anyway, the whole case ended on a mistrial in October of 1957, but Confidential magazine was never the same. Robert Harrison lost effectively millions of dollars in today's money on his own defense. Confidential magazine was entirely retooled, publishing pedestrian pablum and columnizing consumer concerns. It would eventually close down in 1978. But there's more to the story, because I want to tell you about the ultimate fate of Howard Rushmore, and this guy is basically a James Ellroy character, right? Now, despite the fact that there was a mistrial for the larger case, Robert Harrison and Confidential magazine were facing a number of individual lawsuits from people like Errol Flynn and Liberace. But before the ink was even dry on those settlements, Howard Rushmore would be dead. This is just from Wikipedia. Quote, on January 3rd, 1958, at 6:15 p.m., a few days before Frances Rushmore, that's Howard's wife, was scheduled to lead a group of editors on a trip to Brazil, the Rushmores met inside the lobby of their apartment building in a final attempt at reconciliation. Frances was due to have dinner at the Dobbins at 8 p.m. When an argument broke out between the couple, Frances left to hail a taxi. Taxi driver Edward Perlman picked her up at Madison Avenue and 97th Street. Simultaneously, Rushmore entered the cab. As the two continued arguing, Perlman ordered him out of the cab, to which he replied, quote, I'm her husband. Don't worry about it. Where do you want to go? Perlman asked. Take me to a police station, Frances said. As the cab raced to the 23rd Precinct at 3rd and 104th, Rushmore shot Frances in the right side of the head and neck, then put the pistol to his temple and shot himself. Both died. At the police station, an unregistered .32 caliber Colt revolver was found in Rushmore's hand and a 7-inch commando knife inside the waistband of his trousers. Jean Dobbins, that's the Rushmore's daughter, speculated that her mother's refusal to take Rushmore to Brazil might have started the argument that ended in the shooting. Contrary to general expectations, Dobbins said her parents quarreled over, quote, personal things, not Rushmore's controversial public life. He was very possessive, very jealous, and wanted to go everywhere with her, end quote. A police search of the Rushmore apartment at 16 East 93rd Street revealed, quote, a valuable gun collection, along with an extensive collection of pornographic pictures, end quote. Now, Howard Rushmore had the kind of raving intensity and cartoonish single-mindedness to make him fit to be a character in American Tabloid. He was a man who played around with distortions of the truth to carry out his own weird agenda. And on some level, he's kind of similar to Ellroy himself, though I think James Ellroy's ultimate pursuit is far more noble than Rushmore's was. Now, we're still thinking about American Tabloid along this spectrum between fiction and nonfiction. Now, we're still thinking about American Tabloid on this spectrum between fiction and nonfiction. And this next bit, I'm going to lean into the framework of a purportedly true genre, of which American Tabloid and Ellroy's other work heavily draws, and tell you one of the wildest stories of the 1950s and 60s. Some of it is absolutely true, and some of it, with a little imagination, could just about answer the question of who really killed JFK. And this is going to involve going in-depth on a man who is little more than a secondary or even tertiary character in American Tabloid, Chuck Rogers. Now, Charles Rogers has had an entire book written on him in an attempt to prove that he killed Kennedy. This is 1992's The Man on the Grassy Knoll by John R. Craig. And his life story is actually kind of insane. But before we actually tell that, I want to just read this bit from American Tabloid in which Chuck Rogers kind of stars. Quote, Pete, that is Pete Bondurant, pulled up to the cab stand. A mango splattered on his windshield. The street was void of tiger cars and tiger riffraff. Placard wavers prowled the sidewalk, armed with bags full of too ripe fruit. Jimmy called him in L.A. yesterday. He said, "Earn your 5%. The Kennedy bug went down, but you still owe me. My Cubans have been batshit since Castro took over. You go to Miami and restore fucking order, and you can keep your 5 fucking..." Somebody yelled, "Viva Fidel!" Somebody yelled, "Castro, el grand puto comunisto." A garbage war erupted 2 doors down, kids tossing fat red pomegranates. Pete locked his car and ran into the hut. A redneck type was working the switchboard, solo. Pete said, "Where's Fulo?" The geek yucked. "The trouble with this operation is half the guys are pro-Batista and half the guys are pro-Castro. You just can't get guys like that to show up for work when there's a nifty riot in progress, so here I am all by myself." Pete said, "Where's Fulo?" The geek yucked. "The trouble with this operation is half the guys are pro-Batista and half the guys are pro-Castro. You just can't get guys like that to show up for work when there's a nifty riot in progress, so here I am all by myself." I said, "Where's Fulo?" "Working this switchboard is an education. I've been getting these calls asking me where the action is and what should I bring. I like Cubans, but I think they're prone to untoward displays of violence." The geek was cadaver thin. He had a bad Texas drawl and the world's worst set of teeth. Pete cracked his knuckles. "Why don't you tell me where Fulo is?" "Fulo went looking for action, and my guess is he brought his machete. And you're Pete Bondurant, and I'm Chuck Rogers. I'm a good friend of Jimmy and some boys in the outfit, and I am a dedicated opponent of the worldwide communist conspiracy." A garbage bomb wobbled the front window. 2 lines of placard wavers squared off outside. The phone rang. Rogers plugged the call in. Pete wiped pomegranate seeds off his shirt. Rogers unhooked his headset. "That was Fulo. He said if El Jefe Big Pete got in, he should go by his place and give him a hand with something. I think it's 917 Northwest 49th. That's 3 blocks to the left, 2 to the right." Pete dropped his suitcase. Rogers said, "So who do you like, the Beard or Batista?" Now I'm going to continue reading a little later, and this is after they've disposed of the bodies of a couple troublemakers associated with the Tiger cab stand. Quote, "Fulo smashed their teeth to powder. Pete burned their fingerprints off on a hot plate. Fulo dug the spent rounds out of the wall and flushed them down the toilet. Pete quick-scorched the floor stains. Spectrograph tests would read negative. Fulo pulled down the living room drapes and wrapped them around the bodies. The exit wounds had congealed. No blood seeped through. Chuck Rogers showed up. Fulo said he was competent and trustworthy. They dumped the stiffs into the trunk of his car. Pete said, "Who are you?" Chuck said, "I'm a petroleum geologist. I'm also a licensed pilot and a professional anti-communist." "So who foots the bill?" Chuck said, "The United States of America." So who was Chuck Rogers? Charles Frederick Rogers was born on December 30th, 1921 in Houston, Texas. His mother would work as a distributor of Stanley home products, cleaning supplies and the like, and was an outgoing, active member of the community and church. His father had been raised in Comanche, East Texas, and had managed to get off of the prairie and acquire an electrical engineering degree, but the industry had not suited him, and for a time he worked as a furniture salesman. However, his enthusiasm for the horses led to a relationship with organized crime, specifically when Carlos Marcello, the Louisiana mob boss, horned in on the Houston gambling operations. Fred Rogers became one of the dozens of bookies in Houston who had to pay for Marcello's wire services. Charles' sister, Betty, had died in a car wreck on a family vacation in 1929 when Charles was just 7 years old. Charles blamed his father for this. Now, Charles was interested in music and as an adult would accrue an extensive collection of musical instruments. He was also very gifted in science, mathematics, and engineering. He attended Sam Houston State Teachers College in Huntsville and completed 2 years before withdrawing to work for Shell Oil for a while. Apparently, he invested some of his earnings into real estate, which would pay off substantially 15 years later. In 1942, he enlisted in the Navy and served for 30 months on the USS Barnes and the USS Richmond and was discharged in 1945 as a radio technician. After that, he attended the University of Houston on the GI Bill. There, he majored in physics with minors in math, engineering, and chemistry, and he graduated with honors, as well as good standing in the physics honors fraternity and Mensa. He would also briefly attend UT Austin in pursuit of a master's, but would quit with 9 more credit hours required. In 1950, Rogers took a job at Shell Oil Company once again and moved in with his parents in Houston. For a time, he seemed to have a relatively normal life, other than arguably living with his parents. Like many at the time, he was anti-communist, but in Charles' case, he was particularly voracious. He joined the Civil Air Patrol, where he would end up meeting David Ferry. And if you've seen the Oliver Stone JFK film, David Ferry is played by Joe Pesci. And this was before Ferry was ousted from the organization for getting weird with some of the young men. In 1954, Charles Rogers was suddenly transferred to a traveling seismology team within the company, and then, according to the author of The Man on the Grassy Knoll, an oil executive spy within the industry was asked by the CIA to interview Charles as a potential contract. Apparently, the two men were impressed by each other, and Charles Rogers decided that involving himself in espionage was the right move. According to an anonymous source that Craig, the author of The Man on the Grassy Knoll, calls Leopard, Rogers was soon training as a covert agent for Latin American operations. In 1956, Rogers was transferred to Calgary, and the following year he abruptly quit his job, giving no reasons. However, the author of Grassy Knoll claims it was at this moment that he went full-time CIA. On paper, it seems he would never work in any official capacity another day in his life. He also seemed dead set on disappearing out of the bureaucracy. In fact, one of only 2 photos in existence of Charles Rogers was his employee ID from Shell. Now, after the job at Shell, he apparently cashed in on his real estate earnings, netting himself about $10,000, close to $100,000 in today's money, and gave half of it to his parents to pay off their mortgage, giving himself a 50% share in the house. He then promptly moved into their home on a quiet street in the Cherryhurst neighborhood of Houston. Now, at this point, to most people who knew him personally, Charles receded from the world. He stowed away in his room, locked up behind a deadbolt, from which he would almost never engage with his parents or his neighbors. He kept a hot plate and a toaster oven and prepared his own food in his bedroom. Even relatives and family friends who paid the home a visit would state that they had not seen him for years. A maid at one point even claimed that Edwina, Charles's mother, had stated that she had not seen her son in 5 years, despite the fact that he was in the house when she said it, though this might have been an exaggeration, and that she would only communicate with him by slipping notes under the door. In 1959, apparently, Edwina intervened when she came upon Charles trying to choke his father to death. He was so reclusive that, in a later investigation, a detective stated that, quote, "I have never seen anyone who is so little known. Actually, we know little more than the fact that he exists," end quote. Now, he did apparently have some hobbies. It turns out that, according to the Man on the Grassy Knoll book, Charles had a sophisticated shortwave radio setup that he'd installed in the attic, one that was clearly designed to maximize transmission power with an extensive antenna arrangement running along the ceiling joists, which was, it should be noted, both more cumbersome and expensive than a roof-mounted unit would be. It seemed that Charles had thought it crucial that his radio gear be secret. He also had something of a reputation in the neighborhood for creeping around in the middle of the night and sometimes going through the neighbor's garbage, though, interestingly enough, whenever he left the house, he was very well dressed, and one of the only places he was known to frequent was the local laundry. I mean, how many recluses do you know who care about having an impeccable presentation, right? He was also, as noted in American Tabloid, a licensed pilot, and at least for a while he owned a Cessna 140, which he kept at a small airport near Sugar Land. He would tell people that his frequent trips to places like Austin were all part of his job as a salesman for a water purification equipment company, which, it seems, was a total fabrication. The plane would be sold in the fall of 1963. Now, this book, The Man on the Grassy Knoll, claims, leaning very heavily on some unnamed sources, that it is in these secluded years that Charles Rogers was heavily involved in intelligence operations. Supposedly, he flew supplies for Castro guerrillas when the CIA was supporting Fidel, rendezvousing on tiny beaches with groups of revolutionaries. Later, he'd apparently be involved in the preliminary stages of Operation Pluto, the planned invasion more commonly known as the Bay of Pigs, flying alongside none other than David Ferry, often through the unrestricted airspace of Mexico, which led to a dearth of flying records for investigators. The book also claims that he likely became a CIA assassin during this time and that he was a communications advisor teaching Cubans how to use radio tech. After the Bay of Pigs, supposedly Charles Rogers was also put on the ground to conduct reconnaissance on the missile situation in Cuba. Now, November 22nd, 1963 happens. JFK is assassinated. If we've read our American Tabloid and we've read our Libra, we know that there's a pretty good chance that there was some confluence of factors and entities involved. The CIA, the Cubans, the Mafia, former G-men weirdos like Guy Bannister and David Ferry. And okay, we've got some anonymous sources saying that Rogers was involved in all this Cuba stuff, that he was a CIA contractor, etc. But what evidence is there that Rogers had anything to do with JFK? Well, this depends on how much we trust the testimony laid out in The Man on the Grassy Knoll of Elmer and Marietta Gerhardt. Now, outwardly, there seems to be no reason why these people would be involved. Elmer was a pastor who'd started up his own church in the 1940s in Houston. His church was just a few blocks from where Rogers and his family lived and was one that could count among its parishioners the mother of Charles Rogers. Now, an important note here as well is that around 1946, while on vacation in Mexico, Elmer Gerhardt had befriended a curious stranger by the name of Carl Froelich, who would occasionally visit him in the ensuing years. Elmer Gerhardt claimed that his contact with Froelich had served a key function in getting Charles Rogers hooked up with the CIA. Fast forward to 1963, September 25th. Two men showed up at Elmer's door who said their names were Charles and Lee, and that their mutual friend Carlos had indicated that if they found themselves in a pinch in Houston, they could call on the Gerhardts. The Gerhardts invited them in, offered them some refreshments and the use of a telephone until they could get picked up by this Carlos fellow. The Gerhardts, dying of curiosity, sneakily followed these strange visitors outside to see that their contact Carlos was none other than the strange local man Charles Rogers. The other Charles with Lee, according to this theory, was none other than Charles Boyd Harrelson, the father of Woody Harrelson and a known hitman for hire who has often been suspected of involvement with the JFK assassination. Now, a couple months after that weird nighttime knock on the door, JFK was shot, and the Gerhardts were stunned to see an oddly familiar face on the television, that of one Lee Harvey Oswald, who they said was an exact match for the Lee that had stopped by their home. So this is all stuff you may have never even heard of, even if you are interested in the JFK assassination. Here's how Charles Rogers may, according to the author of The Man on the Grassy Knoll, fit into the more common, let's call it the Oliver Stone set of facts. The idea seems to be that Charles Rogers at some point became the handler of Charles Harrelson and Lee Harvey Oswald under the direction of Guy Bannister. That's Tommy Lee Jones in the JFK movie, and a supposedly former CIA or FBI agent and private eye. As part of handling Lee Harvey and Charles Harrison, Rogers put them up in a Houston safe house owned by none other than Carlos Marcello. This was right around the time that the Gerhardts had a late-night visit. The idea here being that this stop in Houston was kind of a waypoint in a bigger operation that DeLillo talks about in Libra. And this is the whole thing where Lee Harvey Oswald goes to Mexico to try and get a visa to go to the Soviet Union. And, the idea that the whole thing was a sort of a sheep-dipping operation to get someone that was going by the name Lee Harvey Oswald ID'd in Mexico as being up to anti-government activities, right? Now, the authors of this book also claim that Charles Rogers was the boisterous stand-in for Lee Harvey Oswald at a shooting range in Dallas in October, which again, DeLillo referred to in Libra, and is a noted moment among people who've looked deeply into the assassination. Similarly, they claim that Rogers was the man who visited a car dealership, gave the name Lee Oswald, and took a red Mercury Comet on a wild test ride. And this is actually an incident that was investigated in the Warren Commission, and they found that the physical description of this test driver actually matched much more closely that of Charles Rogers than that of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, the day of the assassination, the claim here is that while Oswald may have pulled a trigger, he was merely the fall guy, that it was really Charles Rogers and Charles Harrison on the grassy knoll with rifles who did the deed. If you've heard of the three tramps arrested on the day, the picture of them given as evidence seems to many eyes to include two Charles. Charles Harrison, who would make a deathbed confession that he was involved in the JFK assassination, and Charles Rogers, that Houston recluse and mysterious seismologist. I won't go further into the many questions about the specific happenings on November 22nd. Maybe Charles Rogers was involved, and there are many other links and claims that I'm not going to go into here. Or maybe the whole thing about him being a secret government agent is just a story. Whatever the case, after the assassination, Charles Rogers ostensibly, at least from the perspective of his family and neighbors, continued his secluded life on the second floor of his parents' house. But on June 23rd, 1965, Father's Day, things took a turn.
Well, tonight's case from the text files is a bizarre murder mystery.
One filled with intrigue, allegations of CIA connections. Some even have tried to tie it to the Kennedy assassination. It's the case of the Icebox murders. June 23rd, 1965, Houston patrolmen asked to check up on an elderly couple, find a house on Driscoll Street empty. But almost as an afterthought, they checked the kitchen.
Opened up a refrigerator and seeing nothing but meat stacked in the refrigerator. My partner standing next to me made the comment that he thought that somebody had butchered a hog. We didn't know it was a body until we got ready to close the refrigerator, and we could see the head down in the bottom of the vegetable bin.
Two bodies in the icebox, 81-year-old Fred Rogers, his 79-year-old wife, Edwina. But the third resident of the house, their son, 43-year-old Charles Rogers, then and now the only suspect, was gone.
I've never been able to understand how someone could commit an act like this and disappear off the face of the earth.
Now, I'm going to read a little bit of a dramatization from The Man on the Grassy Knoll by John R. Craig, and nobody knows if this is how it went down, but it's plausible. Okay. Quote, Edwina refused to be intimidated by her son and said, "No, I'm too old and sick to keep living like this." She began to get angry at the thought of all the years wasted behind a wall of silence and marched into the room. "I went to see your Uncle Edwin last week up in Shiro, and I've made arrangements with him to either borrow the money to buy you out or else let you buy our half of the house. Edwin said we could live with him on one of the houses on his ranch. We have to decide which way to go." "You can't force me to make that decision," Charles declared. "How dare you come up here and make ultimatums to me? You wouldn't even have a place to live or food to eat if it weren't for me." He was livid with rage. "Well, that's just too bad. I'm sorry you don't like it, but I just can't live on your money anymore," Edwina replied decisively. "What's wrong with my money?" Charles asked derisively. "It isn't any dirtier than Dad's money, and you had no problem with that for many years." No, it's not the same thing at all. He never lied, cheated, or killed for it. I'm not as stupid as you seem to think. I know where you were a year and a half ago, in Dallas. And I think I know what you and your friends did. It's wrong how that other boy took all the blame. To think I was worried sick about you being dead in an airplane crash. Don't you imagine, after all these years that I've taken phone messages for you, that I've figured out who you work for and what you do for them? I'm not going to keep taking these calls anymore. They scare me. Why do they scare you? Charles asked, menacingly. He had moved around his mother and was now blocking the door. And what are you talking about anyway? I never was in Dallas, and I have no idea what you think I did. End quote. Now, supposedly, after this confrontation with his mother, Charles Roger beat her with a claw hammer. And then, when his father came to see what was the matter, Charles beat him to death with a hammer. To finish the job, he had to shoot his mother in the head with a .22 caliber Huntsman pistol. After he'd killed them, Charles Rogers donned a raincoat and, one by one, pulled their bodies into the downstairs bathtub where he cut them into manageable pieces using a 20-inch keyhole saw, a straight razor, and likely a hunting knife and large pair of scissors. He chopped up their softer tissues and flushed them down the toilet, a fact discovered only weeks later after local complaints of an odor in the sewer, and fit their body parts into a single body bag and crammed them into their freezer. After which he used the ample Stanley cleaning products around the house to clean up the best that he could. He left no fingerprints. And then after this, he disappeared. A major manhunt and investigation was launched, of course. The killings were called the Icebox Murders, and if you search that term, you'll find all kinds of videos and articles about this. Now, Charles Rogers was never found, but there were some clues along the way. A company in Houston said that the day after the murders were discovered, a well-dressed man fitting Charles's description and wearing a fake mustache and dyed eyebrows came in asking if they had any available work as a welding supervisor overseas. However, he refused to provide any references or offer his full name. It also seems that Charles snuck into the cemetery where his parents would be buried and mowed their funeral plot. Since that time, there have been no significant developments in the case. Charles Rogers has never been located. In the years following the disappearance and the investigation, Rogers became a boogeyman for Houston children. He never used his social security number, never used his pilot's license, and while we can assume he's almost certainly dead at this point, there has not been a trace of his existence since the early days of the investigation. Now, that's all I've got for this madness episode inspired by James Ellroy's great novel, American Tabloid. If you're listening to this, that means you're a paid supporter of Method and Madness, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I've got a lot of cool stuff in the works, talking The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe and Shadow Ticket by Thomas Pynchon, along with a bunch of great Melee guests lined up for the rest of the year. Take care. I'll see you on the next one.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had it bad. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had. He went down to the dope shop one Saturday night. He knew the lights would all be burning bright. Well, I guess he smoked a dozen pills or more. When he woke up, he was on a foreign shore. The Queen of Sheba was the first he met. She called him lovey-dovey and honey pet. She gave him a great big automobile with a diamond headlight and a golden wheel. Down in Honolulu, Willie fell in a trance, seeing the dusky beauties do the hula dance. His sweetie got in jail and Willie sure did shout when he got the news that she had wiggled out. He landed with a splash in the river now, riding on a sea-going crocodile. He winked at Cleopatra, she said, ain't he a sight? He said, how about a date for next Saturday night? He had had 1,000,000 cattle and he had 1,000,000 sheep. Had 1,000,000 vessels on the ocean deep. Had $1,000,000 all in nickels and dimes. Well, he knew because he counted it 1,000 times. He landed in New York one evening late. He asked his sugar for an after date. Started to kiss her and she started to pout when bang, bang, and the door gave